Hey guys, welcome back to our walkthrough of classic poetry. Today I want to go over the poem The Intellectual, which is by one of my favorite poets of all time, the ancient Persian poet Rumi. Now in The Intellectual, Rumi is describing and contrasting two different groups of people. The first of which he calls the intellectual, and the second of which he refers to as the lover. Now, in our modern era, we wouldn't necessarily use those terms to describe the groups of people he's talking about. The lover, for instance, we would probably use terminologies like the romantic or the idealist or the dreamer to describe them, whereas the intellectual we would probably describe as the cold and calculating realist. But I don't want to say too much more about this poem before we read it because there's going to be a lot to discuss afterwards, so I have it down below as always so you can follow along as I read aloud, and here's the intellectual. The intellectual is always showing off. The lover is always getting lost. The intellectual runs away, afraid of drowning. The whole business of love is to drown in the sea. Intellectuals plan their repose. Lovers are ashamed to rest. The lover is always alone, even surrounded with people. Like water and oil, he remains apart. The man who goes to the trouble of giving advice to a lover gets nothing. He's mocked by passion. Love is like musk, it attracts attention. Love is a tree, and lovers are its shade. I love the way he introduces these groups of people. It's such a goofy introduction, especially the lover, right? The lover is always getting lost. It always makes me smile. But he starts off by introducing the intellectual. And what he says is characteristic of this group of people is that they're always showing off. So what does he mean by that? Well, here's how I like to think of it. The intellectuals and realists among us are always breaking life down into its basic known quantities. You know, they want to know things like, what's my situation? What would I like my situation to be? And what are the steps that I need to take to most effectively get from where I am now to where I'd like to be, right? Basic, cut, dry. But the best and the brightest of the intellectuals doesn't just want to better their circumstances. They want to better their circumstances in such a way that at the end of the day, they're just a little bit better off than everyone else. Because then they'll be able to show off. They'll be able to take pride in their own achievements over the achievements of their fellow man. Now, there's a verse in the Bible that echoes this same idea that was written by King Solomon, whom incidentally the Bible says was the wisest man who's ever lived. And in his book Ecclesiastes, he kind of takes a step back to survey the kingdom and see all the things that they've accomplished as a nation. And he said something very striking. He said, I saw that all labor and all achievement springs from a person's envy of their neighbor. Now, when I first read that, I was pretty blown away because I thought he's talking about keeping up with the Joneses, and this was written almost 3,000 years ago. I thought that was a modern convention, something that we invented. And while we may have invented the phrase, we definitely did not invent the practice because it was clearly alive and well 3,000 years ago in ancient Israel. And it was also alive and well in the 1200s when the intellectual was written, because Rumi notes the same thing, that what is characteristic of this group of people is that they're always showing off. They always want to one-up their neighbor. They think that the chief purpose of life is to just outdo everyone, just do a little bit better, be able to take pride in your achievements over the achievements of your fellow man. He then goes on to introduce the second group of people, which he calls the lover. And what he says is characteristic of this group of people is that they're always getting lost. Now, it sounds kind of disparaging, right? Like they're just some kind of inept fools that can't ever seem to get to where they're going. But I don't think he's trying to be disparaging. To me, what he's trying to say is that the lover, this idealistic dreamer, is kind of a restless wanderer. They have this deep-seated longing in their hearts to live their lives to the full, and they don't necessarily know how to carry it out. They just know that they need to do something more than what they see in the society around them. They want to love more fully and to live more fully and to love more deeply, but they don't necessarily know how to carry it out. And so from that standpoint, they're always lost. Henry David Thoreau, in his book Walden, explained why he wanted to leave the society of his day to go live in the woods at Walden Pond. And in his chapter called Where I Lived and What I Lived For, he just said, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not when I came to die discover that I had not lived. Do you get the sense from that quote that he doesn't even really know what he's going to find when he gets out to Walden Pond in the woods? He just said, I have to live deliberately. I'm going to go and see if I can't learn what life has to teach. Because if I don't, I'm afraid that I'm going to come to the end of my life and feel like I haven't really lived. So you can just see that he doesn't really necessarily know what he's going to find when he gets out there. He just has this deep-seated longing inside him to live more fully and to do something different than what he's seen in the society around him, and it compels him away to go and try something new. And that's what I think Rumi is trying to say here when he says that the lover is always getting lost, that they're this restless wanderer that's being compelled away from the society at large. And he echoes that same idea later in the poem when he says the lover is always alone, right? They just don't feel at home in the society around them. They're always alone, like oil and water, he notes. And that's what I think he's echoing the same idea later in the poem. And he goes on to say that the intellectual runs away, afraid of drowning. The whole business of love is to drown in the sea. Isn't that such a beautiful second part? The whole business of love is to drown in the sea. I love that. But it's kind of tragic how he starts off. He says the intellectual runs away, afraid of drowning. I think if you were to ask most people what the purpose of life is, their answer would be to love, whether that's the romantic love, the love for children, the love for your fellow man, the love for God. The chief goal of life, in most people's opinions, is to love as fully as you're able. And what Rumi is saying here, tragically, is that the intellectual runs away from love. They're missing out on the actual point of life. And why is that? Well, he says because they're afraid of drowning. Because if what we said before is accurate, that intellectuals are just breaking life down into basic known quantities, well, love isn't like that. It's not just something you can take a scoop out of and add into your life, to better your circumstances. It's an immersive force that you have to drown in order to really experience. And you might have to abandon some of your vain pursuits in order to really experience it. And the intellectual is not willing to do that because it conflicts with what they feel like is the chief goal of life. There's something that Jesus said that I've always found just so profound because it's just simple. He said that the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. A man found it and then hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold everything he had and he bought that field. It just shows you how we were built, right? We were built to sell everything we have. When we find those things of true value, when we find those things that really make life worth living, we were built to sell everything we have, to abandon our vain pursuits, because this thing that we've just found is better. It's more real than all the other things, all the vain pursuits of the intellectuals. And that's just how we were built. Rumi then goes on to say that intellectuals plan their repose and lovers are ashamed to rest. Now, repose is a word that we don't really use much in modern culture. It's just a period of rest and relaxation. It's what you would do at the end of a long day. But how I like to think of what he's saying here is you could say intellectuals plan all the ways they will amuse themselves when they're no longer working, right? Because the word amusement is actually a really fascinating word that most people haven't taken the time to consider what it means. Because if you break the word amusement down into its root words, you get a and muse, right? So anytime you add an a to something, like if a person is amoral, it means they're without morals, or apolitical, it means they're without a political stance. To add the word a to something means to say that you're without it, right? So to be amused means you're without a muse. Now, if you know your ancient Greek culture, you know that the muses were those beings that were said to inspire people, right? So that's why they say that a poet or a songwriter has their muse, right? It's what they get their inspiration from. So to be a muse quite literally means to be without inspiration. And that's something striking because we live in an age of unprecedented technologies, distractions, entertainment, and amusement. And what Rumi is saying here, and what the actual word amusement itself echoes, is that to live a life of inspiration is kind of opposed and clashing with, a culture of amusement. And I'm not trying to say that we should never be able to just relax at the end of a long day, you know, that we've earned it, right? We've worked hard. We should be able to come home and maybe watch an episode or two of our favorite show. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but what we should consider is that we live in a culture of unprecedented entertainment and amusement. And what Rumi is saying, and the word itself, amusement, is also echoing, is that a culture of amusement is counter to a lifestyle of inspiration. So if you're a person that feels like you don't really have anything you're passionate about, and you don't really feel like you live your life to the full or live a life of inspiration, well, you might have to take more risks. You know, like Thoreau said, I went to the woods because I wish to live deliberately. You know, those things, passions and inspiration, it's not really gonna come and find you when you're just at your ease, you know, watching your favorite TV show. It's something you got to get out there and live life. So it's just something interesting to consider, because most people have never really taken the time to actually study what the word amusement itself means. And that's why I think Rumi is saying that lovers are ashamed to rest. You know, they don't want to just sit back and not care about their lives. They want to get out there and live their lives to the full. So he's saying they're ashamed to be amused. They don't want to just detach and just, you know, take life easy and forget about things. They want to get out there and they want to live their lives to the full, you know, and live with passion. So the rest of this poem, I think, with the context that we've talked about thus far, is kind of self-explanatory. I don't think we need to read the rest of it. You're welcome to read it another time or two on your own, because it's a fantastic poem. And we're going to go over more of his work in our upcoming walkthroughs, because he's got a lot of great stuff. So thanks for sticking with this walkthrough, and I look forward to seeing you next time.